How often are we presented with a question we don't know the answer to, but we bet we can figure it out if we just are given some time and guidance? Well, that's basically what inquiry-guided methods are all about. So in this presentation, I want to describe the benefits and challenges of inquiry-guided learning. You'll be able to discuss strategies for implementing this approach in a college course, and more specifically, propose how you can implement one of them into your content area. So what is inquiry-guided learning? Well, it's essentially giving students a challenge. It could be a question they need to answer, a hypothesis they need to test, data they need to interpret, a situation they need to, propose a solution to, and they have to learn whatever they can to meet the challenge. Now, these challenges can have a limited or a broad scope, and there are strategies we will use as instructors, about how much information to give them, what sources they can use. But the students essentially are just being presented with a situation they don't know the answer to, and they are charged with learning as much as they can and proposing an outcome. This is an umbrella approach for other teaching methods. We're going to talk more specifically about the CASE method, but this could also involve problem-based learning, discovery learning, project-based learning, and just-in-time teaching. And the textbook explains these in a little more detail. So why use inquiry-guided learning? Well, it is an active learning approach. It's not passive. Students have to be actively engaged in discovering knowledge for themselves. So it requires multiple modes of higher order thinking. They're not simply receiving the information, they're actively pursuing it. It does introduce desirable difficulties, meaning at first it's a little frustrating that you're not giving them all the answers, but then students should be given the freedom to let their imagination run wild and try to find a solution and, draw upon what they discover, what they know, to come up with that. So it has been found to foster academic achievement. As you can imagine, it improves critical thinking, reflective learning, problem solving, and even when used in a laboratory, can help enhance those skills. Really, it helps level the playing field because there's not a penalty for lack of content knowledge. When you propose this question to students or, the situation, the case, you're asking them to go find out and learn more. So it can help improve gains in science and technology understanding, intellectual development, and vocational preparation. So helping them see the types of problems they might encounter in a particular vocation or career field, and then discover how they would go about solving that problem. There's a basic 3-step procedure that you can use in this approach for inquiry-guided learning. The first is to identify the problem. So you or even have your students present a problem or issue you would want them to address. And then you have them work toward possible solutions. And as an instructor, your goal is to help them focus on the process rather than the outcome. So students can be given more flexibility to develop their own strategies in how they pursue that. And then the third step is to establish solutions. So there's no predetermined right answer. You should let them reach their own conclusions and then talk about why they came to that conclusion, what information did they find, how did they, if you're working as a group, how did they manage that process as a group, and so on. So you can imagine it's a bit more ambiguous. There's not a clear-cut way to approach this, and so there are some things that instructors you have to consider with this approach. One of them is the level that you want to implement. So there's different levels of freedom almost in what you give students. So The one with maybe the most teacher support and clear instruction is the guided inquiry. So you provide the research question or situation, case, and you describe the process. And then students design and carry out that and interpret the results. With the second approach, you're giving them a research question, but they have to take responsibility for how they're going to investigate it. So what methods are appropriate? What data should they find? How are they going to draw conclusions? And you're not as directly involved in telling them what to do. The final one is open inquiry. And it is, you can also find literature related to this called for discovery learning or open discovery. But students are generating their own questions. They're designing their methods, they collect data, they present their findings, and so on, with the facilitator serving as, or the instructor serving more as a facilitator or mentor. So you see this more in upper level research methods type courses, courses that are more capstone, because students by then have the confidence to be able to go do those other things independently. When you're designing inquiry-guided learning, you have to consider, again, how involved are you going to be as the instructor. Two of the ways that you can provide support and scaffolding for students to pursue this process are worked examples and process worksheets. So the worked examples is, giving them a problem to serve as a model for how they would approach it. And that helps students see the procedures and logic that they should apply. The other is a process worksheet. So that's more of a sequence of steps that they should follow. This is really helpful in a lab setting. You should do this and then do this. And so that gives students more structure to approach the problem. The instructor's role for this type of approach shifts from, the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. You're more of a facilitator, guide, questioner, coach. You might be a content expert if they need to ask you for your opinion or insight. You have to be able to recognize when to intervene and then when to let students struggle through those desirable difficulties. You can, if you're using this throughout the course of your semester, you could gradually increase the complexity of what you're asking them to do to help train them to build those skills. Those use of scaffolds are important, particularly when you're starting out, to give them more confidence in approaching how to solve the problems. And then you should be embedding reflection because you're trying to help students develop this process of learning and not just here's the right answer. So they need to be able to reflect on their metacognition, they're thinking about their thinking and how they're approaching the problems. In the book, on pages 217 to 218, they list a number of objects of inquiry. These are basically what might students inquire about. So there's, the book does a great job of showing questions and examples for all of these items. So what I'd like you to do for your second discussion topic this week is to review that list on those pages and be thinking about a college course you are designing to teach or that you would want to teach one day. And I want you to identify a question you would ask students to pursue using inquiry-guided learning. So obviously it's not going to be exactly like one in the book, but those should give you a sense of what could you ask students to pursue using this approach. So in your response, I want you to give me that question, that key prompt. And then I want you to tell me what additional scaffolds your students will need. Are you going to provide certain resources, examples, worksheets? What would be most useful, do you think, for them to approach that? And then what are some constraints going to be? One constraint that I didn't add here is just your own experience with this approach. Personally, this is not one I use a lot, and so I would need a little bit more time to consider those this approach and how I would implement it in class. I would start small and try it, and then build on that in additional course periods, that my class was meeting. So that's your second discussion topic for this week. So this approach has its benefits, as we've identified, but it also has challenges. So one is, if you're asking students to work in groups, you'll have to be able to facilitate that group dynamic. And we've already talked a bit about group work, so those issues would still be here. You have to manage your time well. It does, take you out of the direct information provider, and students need to be given some time and flexibility to go discover their own information. So you have to consider that when you're designing your course. It can appear chaotic and unorganized, and some students can be frustrated with that, of not being given a clear direction to follow. And you need to anticipate materials and resources so that if they run into roadblocks, you have something to give them that will help them get past that. And because you're not looking for the perfect answer, assigning grades can be difficult. You need to evaluate the process more than the outcome or solution. And so that might take a little more time to develop what that would look like. So in review, inquiry-guided learning, or just inquiry learning, actively involves students. You ask them a question and you give them direction to find the resources to propose a solution. It can be time-consuming and require adequate instructor preparation, and you might need to step in and be more of a facilitator or coach or guide than the one true, instructor for the course. So with that, it can, as we noted, lead to some very positive cognitive gains and enhance self-confidence in how students approach similar problems in the future.